following presentation shows some technical details for WebLayers Policy Manager in regard to policies used and created for WMQ. This is the WebLayers browser-based user interface. There are a number of function tabs here, and for this presentation we are going to look at some of the features of Policy Manager. All of the WebLayers policies exist in a hierarchical tree structure. At the top of the tree are what we call domains. Domains often correspond to the business unit or product line whose policies it contains. I'm showing WebLayers on a development system here, so my domains are organized by technology for the most part. I'm going to open up a domain, this domain called SOA, and you can see all the libraries. Open up the SOAP library and see there's more sub-libraries underneath. Open up namespace and choose the first policy. So I'm going to use this policy as an example. And let's look at the details of a policy. There are certain sections for policy details. I'm going to open up General. Each policy has a name. You can see here that the name of this policy is do not declare this certain namespace in a SOAP message. The source is Web Services Interoperability Organization, WSI. And I can open up the explanation here, and you can see that this talks about what this particular policy is all about. This namespace is reserved and therefore should not be used when authoring schemas or WSDLs. And it talks about how the wide Web Consortium and WSI prohibit the use of this namespace. All right. Close that and open up implementation. So each policy has its own unique implementation. This particular dialect we're using for this is XPath 1.0. And you can see the expression down here. This is what is actually executed when this policy is used to test against a document. This is a simple XPath expression. It's just looking for this namespace anywhere in the document. If it finds it, this policy will fail. Impact weights. Impact weights are used to measure policy compliance. Each policy can have a number of impacts that we have quite a few defined out of the box, or it could be added through the administrative console. And you can assign a value of 1 through 5 for each weight. 5 being the most severe, 1 being the least. The explanation tells you a little bit about the particular impact. And the measurability is actually expressed through reports that are defined in the dashboard feature of WebLayers. There's a separate tab up here for dashboard. So back to our domain view. I'm going to open up a domain called WMQ. And you can see we have a number of libraries in here that contain policies specifically written for MQ and MQ service definitions. So I'm going to open up a library, the Q properties library, and we're going to take a look at this policy. So let's look at the details of this policy. The name is a queue's default persistence property should be set to persistent for one-way services. This policy is an example of validating not only the XML content of the WSDL, but also taking queue properties into consideration. The policy's intent is to assure that when using a one-way fire and forget service, the destination queue's default property is set to persistent. The reasoning being, if the default persistence property was set to non-persistent, there's a chance that messages could be lost. To see what this Java class does, let's take a look at a WSDL. The class first looks at the port type or interface to determine what operations are defined. If only input type operations are defined, then this class recognizes this as a one-way service. It then reads the queue and queue manager names and connects to that queue and reads its default persistence property. If that property is set to anything but persistent, this policy will fail. Note that this WSDL sets an element called persistence here. But if this wasn't set or handled incorrectly by the application, this policy would catch the issue before the service is deployed and causes a problem in production. One more example. This library, Service Properties, contains policies that validate the WSDL in context to specific properties defined for a service. The name of this property, customers with gold status may use priority 9 messages. All other customers must use priority 4 messages. So the intent here is to give customers who have gold status the highest priority so that their messages are delivered first. This can be accomplished by creating 2 ports in the service section of the WSDL with different binding attributes. Here's an example WSDL. We can see in the service section here that there are 2 ports defined. One here that has a binding attribute, and we note that there's gold word in that binding attribute. And the second port that does not have that gold name. And if we look at the priority element, we can see that 9 is associated with this binding name, gold, and that 4 is associated with the second port. Now, if this priority was set to 9, the policy would fail because there is no gold set here in the binding attribute. So if we look at the implementation of this policy, we can see we're using an XPath dialect and a long XPath expression. But to point out the important parts of this expression, you can see here that if the priority element contains 9 and the binding attribute does not contain gold, this policy will fail, thus assuring the service that only gold customers can use the highest priority messages.